Joining us now is Suzanne Craig, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter for The Times. Suzanne, thank you for being with us on this story. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Did you learn anything in these filings that you did not know or that you didn't anticipate from what you and your colleagues already turned up at The Times?
Well, I was intrigued by one of the legal arguments that surfaced in the documents, which is, these cases are difficult because people like Donald Trump and others often say, when they're in this situation, I relied on the advice of experts. I hire accountants, I hire lawyers, and I rely on their advice. And often that can help them navigate or is just a good shield against these sort of charges. And last night we saw, I think, an avenue that the Attorney General is going to be going down which is, she said, and I'll just read from it, she said that they misstated the purported involvement of outside professionals in reaching valuations. What she's saying there is they were much more involved in setting these valuations than, than we may have thought. And I think she's going to go use that to say that they have some liability potentially here, and that it wasn't that, they were just, phoning the lawyers and the accountants. They certainly had those, but they were very, very involved in some of the valuations that ended up in banks and insurance companies and elsewhere that could get them in hot water.
That's interesting because it had occurred to me that making those misrepresentations to a bank or an insurance company would have itself been a problem in terms of, your duty to be honest to those types of institutions when you're trying to get money out of them. But it would also, as you say, undercut any claim they could have made that they were counting on professional advice in order to come up with these numbers. We
don't know right now. Both could be true. It depends on the evidence that's brought forward. And it's one thing for Donald Trump to sign off on a document and to say, okay, on a Post-it note that this is great. And it's another thing for them to have been heavily involved. But it seems like they're building towards a case that would say that they were heavily involved and were sort of the direct link to, Donald Trump's forwarding information to a bank or, Alan Weiselberg, former CFO, who was CFO for decades. They were deeply involved in discussions on this and in the contact with these financial institutions. That, and that's the contact that could get them in trouble, is potentially filing false information to financial institutions.
And in terms of the documents, and like you mentioned, Post-it notes, one of the things that surprised me is that there's this reference to a filing cabinet. We know that Trump famously doesn't use a computer, doesn't use email, doesn't put his thoughts in a replicable format like that in a way that investigators would, I'm sure, like to see. But there's some sort of filing cabinet with his papers and correspondence that the Attorney General appears to know about. Does that strike you as important?
Yeah, no, I'm not a lawyer, but I would think that would be one of the first things that I would want to look at if I was an investigator. And apparently there is a filing cabinet everything's chronological, and they've kept all of Mr. Trump's Post-it notes and handwritten notes for years, correspondence to employees. We don't know what's in there. I mean, I'll volunteer if they need a middleman to go look. But wow, I'd really like to see that, and that could go to what we're talking about. Millions of documents have been turned over already, according to the filings. But this filing cabinet still is one of the things that there's still a lot of tension over, and they haven't seen it yet. There's other documents as well, but this one in particular was just like, okay, I'd love to see it. I'm sure the investigators would.